heating, space heating, electrifying space heating, electrifying water, electrifying transportation, and ultimately electrifying industrial and commercial processes. But it's more than just electrification. If we electrify, but we still rely on natural gas and oil and coal to generate power, it's not going to get us anywhere. So what we really have to do is transform the electric generation sector to deal with and adopt renewable, zero carbon resources in order to support that electrification. But when you combine both of those two things, what you have is, in the first, in terms of beneficial electrification, the grid itself has to become much, much larger. I mean, imagine today that one in two people in Maine have a car. Post-electrification, the equivalent will be everybody in Maine has 2 cars. And so when you get that kind of increase in the number of cars and you try to run them on the existing roads that we have in Maine, it won't work. You have to expand the roads considerably in order to deal with the traffic flow. Well, the same thing is true of the grid. If we electrify everybody's homes, if we electrify cars and other forms of transportation, then the grid is going to have to be not just double its existing size, but probably triple and maybe triple and a half times the size that it is today. And that's going to cost a lot of money. I estimate on the order of $10 billion in today's dollars. Of course, if there's inflation, it'll go up. But in today's dollars, that would cost about, maybe $10 billion worth of new investment. That's to electrify. On the other side of the coin, we have to meet all of that electrification with renewable generation. And the renewable generation, assuming we don't use nuclear power, the renewable generation that we have available to ourselves is onshore wind, offshore wind, and solar. We have a lot of hydro, but we're not, and we'll continue to have that hydro, but we're not going to expand it. We've already dammed just about every spot that's available to us to dam in Maine on the major river systems. So when we try to increase that amount of generation, that generation has to be connected to the grid, and that has to be connected ultimately to load, and that's going to require a significant expansion of the transmission system in the grid in order to bring that power offshore, onshore, from northern Maine wind down into the southern part of the state, and from solar all the way across the state to the major load centers. And then that is going to cost a lot of money as well. On the generation side, we're probably looking on the order of $60 billion, maybe over the next 30 years. But in any case, it's a lot of money. And so the question then is, what's the best way to accomplish that? And whenever you have to spend or invest a lot of money, one of the things that you want to find is cheap sources of capital. And the cheapest source of capital that we have in this country are revenue bonds issued by public authorities. They are preferentially treated under the tax code. And because the public authority commits the full value of what it invests in to support the bonds, the revenue bonds that are issued, they're able to get a very low rate and increase the amount of leverage, the amount of debt relative to the amount of equity that would otherwise have to be invested. In a way, it's not that much different from buying a home. I mean, what you want, if you're a homeowner, is you want cheap interest rates and the lowest down payment possible. Under our current investor-owned utility system, we have a 50%, the equivalent of 50% down payment on a house. It's 50% of the capital structure of our electric utilities is equity, like a down payment on a house. The interest rate that we pay on a weighted average basis, both capital invested by the shareholders, but also by the bonds that are issued, the weighted average interest is around 8% in today's market. Now, those interest rates are going up, like everything, they float up and down with the economy and what the Federal Reserve Board does, but it's about 8%. Under the alternative, Pine Tree Power, we're able to do that financing with 100% debt, zero down payment. So we don't have to put any equity in on the part of the ratepayers. And we're able to borrow at a rate which 2 years ago, when we started this process, was around 2.8%. It's now higher, it's about 3.8 or 4%, but it's about half the cost of what we otherwise would pay under the investor-owned utility. Now, when you're spending $100,000 or a couple of $1 million, that differential is not a lot of money. But when you're investing going forward, $10 billion, $20 billion to upgrade the grid, the amount that you have to spend to raise that capital and to finance that capital investment really does matter. And so that's the primary reason why I think Pine Tree Power offers us the best opportunity for going forward. A second related issue is what we saw happen with the NECEC line out of Hydro-Quebec that CMP proposed. Now, I know some of you here probably voted against it. Some of you may have voted for it. Personally, I think it's a good idea to have that line connecting us to Hydro-Quebec for lots of reasons, not specifically those that were advocated by Massachusetts or advocated by CMP. I think the primary value for that line is 10 or 15 years down the road, when we can use the vast hydro resources of the province of Quebec as a battery storage system that will offset and allow us to operate renewable energy that's intermittent in a more cost-effective manner. But we can't use any of those resources that are up in Quebec unless we are connected to them electrically, and that electrical connection involves very long transmission lines. And they're not going to be just the one NECEC line. We're going to need 2 or 3 more if we want to make maximum use out of that battery resource that we have. And I use battery in quotation marks because it's a vast storage system of hydroelectric power that they have there. But what we saw in the NECEC line was a reaction to, I think, a reaction to a for-profit corporation utilizing Maine land and resources to make more money for its shareholder. And that is something that's antithetical to people in Maine. And they don't want to see that resource exploited for the benefit of out-of-state or foreign shareholders, or necessarily for the people in Massachusetts. Had that project been proposed by an organization that was Pine Tree Power, owned and operated by the people of Maine, for the benefit of the people of Maine, I think it would have had a lot less opposition. And because we're going to have to build out this grid, we're going to have to put substations where people don't want them. We're going to have to put transmission lines where people don't necessarily want them. We're going to have to develop that grid in a significant way. I think it will be easier. It's not going to be simple, but it would be easier to do if the entity doing it was Maine controlled and it was being done for Maine people and for Maine's benefit, and the profits associated with those activities didn't flow out of state to out-of-state corporations. So it's really those 2 reasons why I support the Pine Tree Power initiative, and why I think it's a timely thing for us to consider, and it's something that we ought to give serious thought to. So I'll stop there, just as an overview, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. If people don't have any, I can talk for 3 hours on this. You can't listen for that long, so I won't do it. But I can. I'll open it up to any questions that people have, and
Thank you.
Kathleen, why don't you moderate it? You field questions, and I'll
I
be happy.
will. I see somebody eagerly raising their hand right now, and that's Kara, Pod Commoner, who is has this question right now.
Hi. Yeah, so I guess my take is that utilities really depend on their regulatory structure, and regardless of who's running it, they need good regulation. So I'm struggling to see why a different, if we regulated CMP well, I think they could do the job. But so I think I worry that we fall prey to the same challenges. I guess, how do you see this being different, and what's the different regulatory structure? And actually, how would that play out in practice?
I don't think the regulatory structure will change. The law specifies, or the referendum question specifies, that the entity, Pine Tree Power, will still be regulated by the Public Utilities Commission. This is an argument that has been used by people who oppose Pine Tree Power, and they say, well, let's let the regulatory system work more effectively. And, the answer is yes, that is a solution to the problem. But the regulatory system that we're dealing with today was put in place in 1913 in Maine. So we've had over a century of regulation. And if we can't get it right over that century of regulation, there's no indication, at least that I can see, that we're going to get it right over the next 20 years all of a sudden. The problem is that the regulatory structure that we have is asymmetric. I mean, you have a utility with significant expertise, significant resources available to it, and incentives that drive its decision-making. Against that, you have a group of public officials that change on a regular basis, that don't have the same degree of expertise or the same degrees of incentives in order to regulate them. It's just an asymmetric structure, and the asymmetry is in favor of the existing utility. We have today examples where the regulatory structure is set up correctly, but ineffectively. For example, Bob was mentioning at the beginning, there are a lot of projects in Maine that are solar projects that want to interconnect to the electric grid. The utility has no particular incentive to interconnect those projects. In fact, every one of those projects is in some degree a headache to the utility. And so what it does is it drags its feet. It slow walks the process. It tries to identify situations in which that interconnection will create problems on the grid, and it goes to extreme conditions in order to demonstrate that they will create problems. The consequence of that is that we aren't interconnecting resources to the grid as rapidly as we should. And this isn't a Maine problem only. If you go anywhere in the country, you will see the same issue. Wind power in Wyoming, solar power in Texas, solar power in Southern California. They're all running into the same problems, and the problems relate to the incentive structures of the regulatory system. Now, part of that incentive structure is that the utilities would like to do these activities themselves. They would like to be in the business of putting in batteries. They would like to be in the business of developing solar projects. And when you have a utility that controls the grid, that either is a direct competitor or would like to be a competitor with an entity that has no control over the grid, what ends up happening is that the utility uses its monopoly power to advantage its other activities. I use as an example, imagine LaGuardia Airport. And let's say that we replaced all of the FAA and the towers at LaGuardia Airport with Delta employees. You can imagine what would happen. The guys from Delta coming in from LA want to land, and the guys from TWA, you can tell how old I am, United Airlines coming in from Chicago want to land, and the FAA guys up there say, Delta, you have priority. I mean, it's only natural you're going to prioritize your own activities. We would never give over the air traffic control system to an entity that competes with other entities for the use of that service. But that's what we have in the electric utility business. And the consequence is that the regulators are always trying to fight that. And that's a tough fight for a regulator to have. Because ultimately, the utility has the sort of the get out of jail card free. And the get out of jail card is, if you do that, regulator, the grid will collapse and we'll have outages. And no regulator ever wants to be in the position of saying, I don't believe you, utility, I'm going to take a chance. That's a career decision that the regulator makes when they make that. Because if they're wrong, they're fired. And that's what we do. We don't treat things correctly from an incentive perspective. So that's why I just don't think the regulatory structure as it is today can effectively regulate the for-profit investor-owned utility. On the other hand, Pine Tree Power doesn't have those incentives. It's not going to make money from installing batteries. What it's going to do is it's going to serve its ratepayers, and the best way to serve ratepayers is to have more batteries interconnected to the grid, to enable that to occur more rapidly, more quickly, and more efficiently, because ultimately its customers, its fiduciary duty is not to the shareholder, its fiduciary duty is to the ratepayers. And so it will act on their behalf. And if it doesn't, we always have the opportunity to vote the board out, right? It's an elected board. They can be thrown out of office just like politicians can be. We have no ability today to vote the board of CMP or Avangrid or Iberdrola or Versant out of office, right? They are appointed by those corporations and they govern in that capacity. So we do have that secondary mechanism that's available to us. Now, nobody wants to use that. Nobody wants to vote people out because they're incompetent. It'd be much better to elect competent people in the first instance. But you do have that check and balance that we don't have today.
I'll keep going if others don't have questions, but
So are there any other questions here?
I see Linda. Does Linda have a question?
Are you picking up everybody?
If I have everybody, I probably don't. Is there another, let me see.
I guess somebody who has a question better speak up. If
Okay,
you can't
Nancy.
see everybody.
It's David with the question, but here you go. We don't know how to do the handheld thing yet.
Apparently. Good evening. Can you address, do you feel able to address the concerns that have been expressed regarding a core of elected board members that may or may not be competent to run a corporation and who, as with elected officials, are going to be perhaps term limited or coming and going. And I mean, I personally have the experience of having served in situations when the learning curve was very steep and it took a long while, and then there were term limits. And so I understand the challenges of maintaining a competent board. And while the proposal is to select others who are experienced in the energy field, there will be a core of members who are elected by and responsible to the ratepayers. I think you see the concern that has been raised to me, and I hope you can address that.
No, I think it's, I mean, again, it's a legitimate concern. The way the board is structured is that there are 7 elected members and there are 6 appointed members. The 6 appointed members are drawn from various sectors specified in the law where they have expertise related to some aspect of the utility industry, whether it's labor, environmental, engineering, whatever that might be. We use this structure for lots of things where we put a lot of our future at risk in. For example, the university system in Maine, right, has an appointed board of trustees. The Maine Turnpike Authority has an appointed board of trustees. Housing Authority has an appointed board. I think, the elected part of the board is a little bit of a weakness in the proposal. On the other hand, I think it's a balancing. It's the ability to have citizen input into who is running and governing, at the same time as allowing that board overall control of the policies and direction of the utility. Remember, the board's function is not to manage. Right? The board's primary function is to choose and oversee the management company that will be selected pursuant to an RFP and a contract. So they have to write the contract, they have to evaluate the bidders, and ultimately select that bidder. And it's that bidder that will ultimately run the system. And so, I understand the concern. I think it's a legitimate concern. I don't think that there's really any way around it. We see elected boards operating in publicly owned utility systems around the country. The city of Austin, Texas, Chattanooga, Sacramento, all of Nebraska, utilities in Iowa. I mean, there are a lot of those utilities that operate with boards that are elected. Just like we have in Maine, we have, water boards that are elected, sanitation boards that are elected, and people run and serve, and they don't necessarily have tremendous expertise in the operations of sanitary systems or the operation of water systems, but presumably they have the ability to select the management team and to oversee the management team and ensure that it operates in the public interest. And that's the primary function of the board. And so that's why I'm not as concerned about the elected part. If the purpose of the board was to run and manage the utility, I think it would be a big mistake to elect people to do that. But it's not.
Can I follow up with another question?
Oh, somebody else first.
So can we, there's a number of people, so.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I think, Brenna, you're next.
Unmute yourself.
Yes. I've been confused mainly by all the ads on TV. Who would do the selection of board members, appointment, and who does the election? Is it the ratepayers that do selection, and who does the appointments? And then to whom is the board? I mean, I understand that they have a fiduciary responsibility, but if it isn't working out well, how is the board replaced?
The board has, as I mentioned earlier, the board has 13 members. 7 of them are elected.
By whom? By whom?
By the voters of Maine, not the ratepayers, the voters.
Oh.
Now the reality is that everybody uses electricity, so they're really one and the same, right? So it's not, but you say the voters.
Yeah.
They will elect, and there's 1 representative for every 5 Senate districts. So the 35 Senate districts, you divide that by 5 and you get 7 board members.
Yeah.
And so that satisfies the constitutional requirement of 1 person, 1 vote, because each of the Senate districts is reasonably close to the same population.
And appointments? Who does that?
Pardon me?
Who does the appointments?
The appointments is, I believe the appointments are done by the board. And so it's the board, once the board is elected, they make the appointments of the other 6 members according to the law. So they have to have certain fields of expertise that they can choose from. So, they may not be able to choose you, for instance, to be as one of those 6 members. They might be able to choose Suzanne, who has a good background in energy and could serve in that capacity. So you'd have to evaluate that, but those 6 members are chosen. Then you have a board of 13.
Mhm.
Now, if you don't like the board, the only way to get rid of the board, I don't believe there are impeachment powers, although I don't know enough about the rest of the constitutional structure of Maine.
Yeah.
But if the only way to get rid of them is when their terms expires to vote them out. Now, there may be other ways if they commit fraud or do things that violate their oaths of office, there may be ways of getting them out, like any other appointed official or elected official. But in this instance, the only real way to do it is to vote them out.
Thank you.
All right. And I think next we have the one or the other of the ESPYs, either Lynn or Jay.
Yeah, I'll turn on my video here a sec. Yeah, Rich, thank you. This is really illuminating. It's helpful to hear your thoughts on this. My question is, in terms of the economics, I guess, of the firm that would be hired to run this for the state of Maine and for the power company that's publicly owned, what are the economics behind that? Who would bid on that? What would be their incentive to enter this field? And who would likely show up to the table, in your estimation?
Sure. The incentive for somebody to do this is to make money, right? I mean, that's the reason why they would want to do it. Now, when you think about what we're talking about here now, we aren't talking about the rank and file members, the linemen, the telephone operators, the billing departments, the credit departments. All of those people who are employed by CMP and Versant will remain in place. What we're talking about is the corporate management structure, and that is fairly thin. It's not a very deep structure. It may be in the situation, it may be 25 or 30 people. Now, who would do that? There are a lot of entities that might want to do it. They may be existing utilities. For example, when Emera, which was Nova Scotia Power, when they decided they no longer wanted to operate Bangor Hydro service territory, they put them up for sale. And people bid on it, but the entity that ended up winning the bid was the city of Calgary. Right? The utility that serves Calgary decided that this was a good way to benefit the people of Calgary by owning the utility and by taking the dividends that the utility is receiving from the ratepayers and bringing it back and repatriating it back to Calgary to support services in Calgary. So you can imagine any of 100 municipal utilities around the country deciding to bid on it, to take advantage of maybe some economies of scale, or to bring their expertise to a different part of the country. City of Austin, Texas. Alternatively, you could imagine other utilities deciding to bid on this. National Grid down in Massachusetts, or sort of Warren Buffett's companies in Nebraska. Mid-America Utilities may want to bid to operate this facility or these facilities. Or it may be somebody completely out of the utility sector entirely that might want to bid. It may be that somebody, believes a banking system or sort of an investment capital company, or somebody else may want to bid to own and operate, not to own, but to operate this utility. Ultimately, the way in which the contract will be written as part of the RFP will provide some indication of for whom this would be attractive. Now, why somebody would like to do it, it's the opportunity to make some money. There'll be I'm sure there'll be performance bonuses and incentives built into the contract. And if you can achieve certain objectives, reducing outage rates increasing billing accuracy, accommodating growth and electrification, interconnecting facilities. I mean, all of these things might be parameters that go into a contract. And if you achieve certain metrics in those parameters, then you end up getting paid extra money for doing it. Bonuses like you would do for any private company based on profits. Here, however, it wouldn't be profitability that would be, the driving factor. It would be performance along certain categories or on certain factors that are built into the overriding law, which says the purpose of this is as follows: to accomplish the following objectives. So I don't think that we'll have any problems attracting interest in this. I think, in fact, somebody may want to do it as a potential loss leader because they see this as an opportunity and an expanding opportunity around the country to do other, if we're successful in Maine in doing this, there probably will be, a half a dozen utilities in the next 3 years, or states in the next 3 years, that want to emulate what Maine has done and try to do it. See, one of the big differences and an important difference between what Maine is doing and what cities have tried to do, like Boulder, Colorado, for instance, is that the electric grid was never built to respect geographic political boundaries, right? It was built to deal with the electrical configuration of end users, generation locations, and the physics of electric flows. The consequence of that is that if the city of Portland, for instance, wanted to municipalize its electric grid, it would have to divide the electric grid in a way that is suboptimal, right? It would have to replicate facilities that now might exist in South Portland or might exist in Falmouth in order to serve Portland. And it would become very expensive to disconnect Portland and to reconfigure the grid in order to serve Portland. And this is what happened in Boulder. And then that raises all sorts of questions about constitutionality and the power of a city. Does the city of Boulder have, for example, the ability to take by eminent domain electric facilities that are in the neighboring city for purposes of serving their load? Chances are it doesn't. And so now you've got to study the system and figure out how you're going to carve out that grid. Maine is an electrical peninsula. Right? When you do the entire state of Maine, you're taking an integrated electric grid that can be physically separated from the rest of the electric grid in New Hampshire to our south and New Brunswick to our north and Quebec. And as a result, it becomes an easy electrical task to do. So as we look at this, and this is something that the opponents have talked about in the past, they've said, look, the city of Boulder tried to do it. It was 15 years in litigation, cost them a lot of money, and in the end, they had to give up. Well, of course they did, because you can't do it in Boulder, but you can do it in Maine. And you can do it very simply. You could do it in other states. New Hampshire could do it. Vermont could do it if it wanted to. There are places where it's more difficult to do. Delaware is a very difficult place to do because the systems, it's so small, and a lot of the systems that serve Delaware are located in Maryland and Pennsylvania. But you could do it, it would just be more difficult to do.
Okay, so thank you. I have a man next to me here who wants to ask a question.
I do. I have one. Richard, we've heard a lot about the inordinate amount of money that this is going to cost us, maybe $13 billion. What can you say about the method at which the price will be established and perhaps its reasonable parameters?
Sure. The first thing I would say is that there are probably only 20 people in Maine that have any capability of interpreting what $13 billion is. If I told you you could buy New York City for $13 billion, you'd say, that's cheap, right?
Right.
Well, I mean, nobody, they say $13 billion, but what is it that you're buying? Right. And people, if you said to any person walking down the street, say, what do you think Versant and CMP together are worth? How much would you pay to buy them? They wouldn't have a clue. So the notion of $13 billion is just it's a number, right? That's made up. Now, in the regulatory arena, and in when you're buying and selling companies, you're willing to pay an amount for that company that's roughly proportionate to what you're going to earn once you own it, right? You're going to pay up to what you're going to make from owning it. You're not going to pay more than that. It would be silly because you'll lose money, just like anything that you buy. And so the question then is, what is, if you own these utilities, not you, but somebody else, if somebody else were to buy these utilities, what could they expect to earn? And the regulatory structure is designed so that they can earn a fair return on the net book value of the assets of the utility. That's the way the regulatory structure is set up by law and by a long series of constitutional and Supreme Court precedents. So if you think the utilities are worth more than their net book value, which today is around $5.5 billion, then you must believe one of two things. Either that the regulatory process is flawed, and you can ultimately, by owning these utilities, take advantage of the regulatory process and earn a higher return than you are otherwise entitled to earn. That is, you can bamboozle the regulators and they will be tricked into paying you or allowing you to earn more than you're otherwise allowed to earn. Or there are ways that you can leverage your ownership of the utilities to make more money in other things. So, for example, if I own the utilities, I might be able to sell people in those service territories air conditioners or heat pumps because they will trust me. And if they trust me as the utility, I can charge them a higher price for those than Joe's hardware store can charge, and I can make more money. So those are the only two ways in which you would think about paying more than net book value, either a regulatory failure or the ability to leverage the ownership to make more money in other areas. Well, in Maine, we've limited what the utilities can get engaged in, right? They cannot engage in generation. They cannot engage in energy conservation. We have the Efficiency Maine Trust to do that. They cannot sell appliances behind the meter. So they really are very limited in what they can do. All they can really do is provide transmission and distribution services that are regulated by the PUC. So my own sense of this is that when we go to court, and ultimately it will go to court in terms of the valuation, the process is that there's we'll call it a special master, but there's an expert that is retained by the commission to value the assets of the utility. If the utilities agree with that valuation, we're done. If they don't agree with it, then we're going to go to court and fight it out in court, just like any other eminent domain proceeding. And what happens is that DOT says they want to buy, they're going to take the 3 feet in front of your house to widen the street. Right? And so immediately, right, what they do is they file eminent domain and they take that property. And they say, we're going to pay you $5,000 for it. And you say, no way, this is worth at least $40,000. And so you go to court and the court decides whether it's 5 or 40 or 18. Right? That's what happens. And it's the same process that will happen here. So my own belief is that when the court looks at this issue, that they will come down on the side of something close to net book value. simply because of the way in which we've structured our industry and allowed certain opportunities or denied certain opportunities to the utility. And that will put us in that $5.5 to $6.5 billion, not the $13.5 billion that the utilities are suggesting that it will be. If tomorrow, I mean, if the court were to say to me tomorrow, we've reviewed this and we think you owe them $13.5 billion, I would say to the Pine Tree folks, don't do it. That's too much money. If they came back and they said, look, it's, you know, I know you think it's worth 6.5, but we think that you ought to pay them 8. I'd say if you paid them 8, that's about the limit, 8.5. Once you get above that, you're paying too much money for the assets of the utility. Right? And so there's a number, look, just like any transaction that occurs. And the process is designed to get to that number quickly through this administrative process, and then to allow the board, right, to decide whether or not it's a reasonable number. So, yeah, I mean, you know, like in anything, I mean, people can pay a little bit too much, and there's always buyer's remorse or regret rather, and seller's remorse. I mean, that's going to happen in any transaction, and you have to deal with that. But I think in this instance, there are going to be so many eyes on it. There's going to be so much attention focused on it that we're going to get to a number that's a fair, reasonable number. 8 billion on a relative basis is about what Versant, NMAX out of Calgary, paid Emera relative to its net book value. They paid 1.5 times its net book value. Now, what the utilities don't tell you is that Emera got lots of bids, right? They didn't just get one bid, they got a lot of bids for their service territory, and they chose the highest one, right? 1.5 times net book value. The others were less than that, right? So, you know, if we use that as the standard, right? It was just recently, it was only a few years ago. If we use that as the standard and we say, okay, let's say it's CMP gets the same 1.5, then we're in the $8 billion range. And those are the numbers that I've used in my analysis and what LEI used in its analysis. Right, what the utilities are doing, and I mean, it's astonishing that anybody would even put this forward with a straight face, but they got a consulting company out of Boston to do it. What the utilities have said is that even though their transaction was 1.5 times net book value for Emera, we can find transactions in the country where utilities have sold for 2 times net book value. Very different utilities that own generation, that could develop wind, solar, could develop nuclear power, sell it to their residents and so on. But it went for 2 times net book value. What they then, which would then give you a $10 billion, $11 billion number. What they then said was, though, between now and when this is resolved, what we're going to do is we're going to be building out the grid. And so the utilities are going to be spending more money, investing more money. And so the net book value is going to go up. And so as it goes up, the value of the entity, the net book value goes up, the value of the entity goes up. And we're going to use that same 2 multiplier. So by the time we get out there into the future, it's, you know, we have $6.75 billion of net book value. We double that and it's $13.5 billion. The notion that an investment made today by the utilities of $100 billion, let's say, on a line, will 3 years from now be valued by a competitor at $200 million is just ludicrous. If you could double your investment, right, by making investments, if you could find somebody who would pay you twice what you put in, you wouldn't stop at $1 billion of investment. You put $50 billion into the grid and hope they pay you 100. It's just patently silly, but that's what they've done. And nobody calls them on this. I mean, it's just, you know, and that's part of the reason why I'm so annoyed by this process. I mean, these are public utilities, right? Their obligation, I understand that they have a fiduciary obligation to their shareholders to get the best deal possible. That's fine. But they should be acting in our best interest. I mean, we give them a monopoly so that they protect us, that they act in our interest. They should be neutral on whether or not they're taken over or not. Right? This isn't an issue that they should have a stake in. Right? If the people in Maine want to buy them out, we should be allowed to buy them out at a fair price. I mean, and they should say, okay, fine, we're here to serve you. Give us a fair price, we'll walk away. But they're not doing that. And not only are they not doing it, they're spending $35 or $40 million rather, to try to convince us of their position. And if they're willing to do that to protect their existence, what else are they willing to do to protect their existence, to enhance their coffers over time? It's just not, I mean, it's fundamentally wrong that they should do this. It's even worse in Versant service territory, because Versant is owned, I mean, if you think about this for a moment, Versant is owned by NMAX. NMAX is a firm hired by the city of Calgary, the city council of Calgary, to run the electric utility in the city of Calgary. Versant is exactly what we want to create in Maine. It's structured exactly the same way. And there are people in northern Maine that I've talked to who say, we don't want a government entity running our utilities. And I say, well, who do you think is the shareholder of NMAX? It's Calgary. I mean, somehow it's okay if the city council of Calgary is the board of directors of the utility. But woe is us if somehow an elected board in Maine becomes the elected board of our utility in northern Maine. It's like Calgary City Council is competent, capable, and really good. But we can't find people in Maine who could be as competent, as capable, or as good. It's just mind-boggling. Just people don't think. And that's what the utilities are counting on, quite honestly.
Thank you.
Wow. Wow.
Do you have other people? in the room?
So we have, well, maybe we'll.
I can stay a little longer if people want to stay. I'm not
Okay,
tired.
okay, great. We have Kara, I think.
Did Mason have his hand up?
No, Mason didn't have his hand up, I
Okay.
don't believe. We have Kara, who has had her hand up for another question, so we should try that.
Thank you. Can you give an example of like what is the largest public utility today? And both in terms of people or customers served and like miles of distribution lines.
Well, they're going to be, I don't know the answer to that exactly, but I can tell you that the largest public utilities in the country are Sacramento Municipal Utility District. It has the unfortunate acronym of SMUD,
Familiar.
SMUD. Right? And Sacramento, I think, is about 1.6 million people now, but it's the city, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's surrounded by PG&E, so it's geographically constrained. The city of Austin is a quite large municipal utility. Chattanooga, city of Chattanooga is quite large. Jacksonville, Florida is quite large. In terms of the number of customers served, all of those are roughly comparable to the state of Maine in terms of numbers of customers served and the types of customers, right? They all have residentials, industrial customers, government institutions, and so on.
Yep.
In terms of the miles of lines, you would go to a rural area like Nebraska. I mean, the state of Nebraska is 100% municipally owned utilities. Now, there are
But
some
they're
bigger-
individual, not one.
Yeah, there are
utility.
big
I
ones
think
and there
that's
are
an
small
important
ones.
distinction.
Well, as I said, there are big ones and there are small ones. I mean, there aren't many people served by some of those big geographic areas, but they have a lot of miles of transmission and a lot of miles of distribution lines that they're serving. but there aren't any trees in Nebraska, right? They got
Now
tornadoes.
we have
and-
a lot of trees.
Well, but they have tornadoes. We don't have tornadoes, right? I mean, it's just there are no really good comparisons in that
Yeah.
regard. But I do think about, it's about 25% maybe of the people in the country
Yeah.
are served by municipals.
Yeah, I'm
Um,
well familiar with that. And the reason I ask this is that I actually work in the energy field, and so I have deep knowledge of this, but that a lot of those municipalities, public power, rural co-ops, I see them as in my work as not having the know-how, the skills, the staff to implement the changes that we want to achieve in Maine. And so my concern is that we are replacing one system with another, but we're actually tying our hands behind our backs because the changes that will be required to make cost a lot of money. And I think what I heard from you is even, with the RFP, that entity still wants to make money. So it seems to get in this circular loop that I'm not sure that we're solving the ultimate problem at hand.
Well, that's and we may not be, Kara. There's no guarantees, as you know, in this world. It may turn out that that the Pine Tree Power takes a little time to grow and understand what it has to do and mature into its position. But I do think, though, that when you look at the incentive structures that will exist under both regulatory regimes, that what you'll find is that by getting rid of that for-profit incentive structure that governs IOUs now and that fiduciary duty to shareholders, that we may be able to make the transition a little bit better. Chattanooga is a good case study. Chattanooga, well before anybody else down in that region of the country, had full internet capability, broadband capability throughout the utility service territory, because the public utility down there decided that it was going to utilize its poles and wires and its connections to residents for that purpose. Didn't make any extra money on it. It just did it. And, that was something that well before anybody else started doing, more recently, Chattanooga did it. Now, if that was an investor-owned utility, they would have had to satisfy payback tests, profit tests, ratio coverage tests, and they would have failed and they wouldn't have done it. So there are trade-offs, but if you are concerned about whether or not the elected board and whether or not that governance structure can work, then you probably should vote against it. There are people that, again, that's a legitimate concern. But I think it's always important to remember that by voting against it, what you're implicitly doing is voting for what we have. And it's not clear to me that what we have is good enough. Now, maybe we can make it better, but we've spent a century trying and we haven't had a lot of luck yet.
Let's do. I think you would.
Okay. Well, are there any more questions?
Yes, I have a quick one.
Okay, Brenda.
Did I hear you give a figure of how much has been spent on advertising against Pine Tree? I'm on cable TV and I'm just astounded with the amount of time I hear all the arguments against Pine Tree.
Yeah. I believe the most recent number that I saw was it's approaching $40 million.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Okay.
I have another question, Bob.
Okay.
Don't know how to.
I have a question.
Okay, Michelle.
Yeah, given whether or not this passes, how likely is it that we're going to be forced to have more reliance on solar and wind power, or maybe even hydro? I've heard from the ocean. How will either one of these? I understand your thought that if it's nonprofit or if they're not answering just to shareholders, it's more likely to happen if we vote yes.
Mm-hmm.
But from what I'm hearing, it sounds like it's not going to pass. And where do we go from there?
Well, no matter whether it passes or not, the climate imperative is going to continue, right? All of our climate's not going to change just because we vote this down.
Right.
We're going to have to make these adjustments and ultimately solve the problems that exist, with our current grid and our ability to interconnect renewable generation to it. I think it's going to be a slower, more difficult process, but ultimately we will get it done. It has to happen. And people are, they're developing systems and developing ways to improve this interconnection process. It's just slow and painful. And it does slow things down. If you're developing a project and the utility says to you that you have to upgrade this particular circuit in order to interconnect your generator to it, and it's going to cost you X amount of money to do it. And even if you pay us that amount of money, given our investment schedule, we can't get to it until 2028. That's a situation in which you say, I can't wait that long. I'm just not going to do these projects. And that's where we're running into now with the utility. Now, could they hire more people and get it done faster? Sure. But if they do that, then rates have to go up because they have to pay for those people, and they don't want to see rates going up. And so the consequence is that they don't do it, they don't hire those people, and we just get this delayed a little bit longer than it otherwise would be or should be delayed. But in the end, either we're going to solve the problem or we're going to face the consequences of the climate problems that we're going to face. And of course, it doesn't matter whether Maine ultimately does this or not. I mean, what really matters is whether the world does it. But you can't ask the world to do something that you're not willing to do yourself. And so you gotta move in tandem here and move forward.
Thank you.
Wow, you can't ask the world to do something you're not going to do yourself. I love it. I'm going to take that right away. Nancy Salmon has her hand raised, and then we'll end. I think that we'll take the last question.
Thank you. Well, this has really been very helpful, and I appreciate both your time and your knowledge. And by the way, the SPs answered, Linda and Jay asked the question I was going to ask as a follow-up. So the last question is, so with such short time and the enormous amount of disinformation that's been put out regarding this legislation, and then there's also the other vote regarding the restricting how much money can be borrowed by a state entity or by a government entity. What do you think are the most effective actions at this time in order to inform people and change their minds if they are concerned or opposed?
I'm not the right person to ask that question, quite honestly. I don't know. I don't know why people vote the way they do. I'm a terrible barometer of whether or not things will pass or not. I'm usually always wrong. And so I just don't, I'm not that tied into the way the general public thinks. And it's probably a failure on my part. It probably should be, but I'm not. So I don't know what the best thing to do is. This is an off-year election. We really don't know who's going to vote. It's going to be probably a fairly low turnout, relatively speaking. And so I think the most important thing, and the thing I know the yes people are focusing on to the extent they can, is to try to make sure that their supporters vote. I mean, that's the key. But whether or not they all come out or not, we'll see. The other part, there's another ballot initiative regarding out-of-state corporations' ability to spend money on referendum. Now, I don't know whether that's constitutional or not. There are probably lawyers on the call that are better able to answer that than I am. But if it turns out that it is constitutional and that it passes muster, then, and if we fail this time around, you can always come back again. And when you do, you're in a situation in which neither CMP nor Versant could spend any money on the campaign because they would both be in violation of the corporate ownership issue, spending money on foreign corporations, spending money on local referendum. So it may be a little bit easier the second time, but nobody wants to consider the second time. especially not us, looking around the table at all of us, you know, the longer we delay this, the less likely we are to see it happen. And we're all getting old here, so.
On that note, Richard, this has been wonderful. You've
Well,
answered so many questions. You laid the groundwork for the questions. You stuck with this longer than we had you engaged for. It would be wonderful to continue, but you've contributed so much to our knowledge. Thank you very, very much.
Well, I'm glad I was able to do it, and I'm glad to see some old friends too on the phone or on the call that is still around and active.
Richard, I would say you're even smarter and more articulate and better looking than I remember you. And that was a high bar. So thank you again.
Thank you, Mason, on all counts.
On
And I
that
think-
note, wait a minute.
I was just going to say, I think that the thing that I've appreciated about Rich all these years is his constancy and his evenness and his ability to tell the story in a way that is real. And I just wanted to say thank you for that. That is a rare gift.
No, I appreciate it, but you know, I've spent the last 40 years practically of my life in the energy field and doing this kind of work, and you know, we've seen an awful lot happen during that time, and Maine has been at the epicenter of a lot of these activities that have occurred, and you know, it's just that this is that critical point where if we don't make this transition to electrification, we just are not going to solve the climate problem, because we're not going to sequester carbon from coal and gas plants. It's just not a feasible technology.
No.
So,
And I do believe this is an educational process. Much as I'd hate to say we come back at this again, the more that people hear, the more people understand, and the more that people question what's always been, the more likely this is going to happen. I just hope it happens in Maine and not someplace else.
yeah, no, I agree. Well, thank you all very much. It's nice to see all of you. And again, no matter which way you think about this issue, you know, go vote. I mean, it's something, there are good reasons to vote against it. I'm not suggesting that there aren't. I mean, one of the things that I didn't mention that some of the environmental organizations are concerned about, and I'll tell you this and then I'll quit, is that their concern is a little bit different from some of the other concerns. Their concern is that the elected board will be so concerned about keeping rates low that they won't make the investments necessary to deal with the environmental imperative of electrification. And, you know, that's a legitimate concern. Back in the 80s, when we had the problems associated with, you know, high oil prices, and we had the energy conservation movement developing in the 80s, some of the least aggressive utilities in terms of moving to energy conservation programs were municipal utilities, because of the concern that it would drive rates up. And so I think, you know, that is a concern that people have, and it's certainly a very legitimate concern. I think there are solutions to that, and we have some of those in place in Maine with Efficiency Maine Trust and with, you know, the PUC continued regulation of them, but it's still something that worries people. And I know CLF, for instance, is worried about that issue and have come down on the side of no. Some of the other environmental organizations have looked at it and decided that they can deal with that issue and have come down on the side of yes. So,
even though you cannot tell us what to vote for, Richard,
I could tell you, but you're not going to listen to me, I hope so.
Well, I think we probably would, but Freeport Can hopes that people have learned, who perhaps hadn't yet decided, have learned it and will vote for it, and others who are already intending to vote for it, talk other people into voting on Tuesday, so we get the best chance of making this pass. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, take care, folks, and hope you have a nice weekend, and vote on Tuesday.
All right. Thank you so
much.
much.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you so much. Can we all clap? How about a round of applause?
Anyway, take care, folks. Bye-bye now.
Bye.